Robert Sungenis Live. This is a program set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And I, as my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, tradition, the scripture, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the saints, the councils, the doctors, the encyclopedias, the catechisms, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every week on Wednesday from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And sometimes at the top of the program, I have a topic that I would like to cover, and that just happens to be today. Someone mailed in a question regarding creation and how to understand it, and they were having trouble because I seem to be saying something different than a lot of other people are. So imagine that. Anyway, that will begin the program for today because I'm going to spend maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes or so on this topic because it's a very important topic, especially since we, as you know, are coming out very soon with our version of creation. This is the first DVD, not available yet, but it's coming, and called How the World Was Made in 6 Days. And when we say 6 days, we mean 6 days. You know, not 6 million years, not 60 million years, not 60 days, but 6 days, because that's what scripture says. That's what the fathers had said. And believe it or not, the church even said that. So that's what we're all about. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to cover that as the first part of our program. And now I was supposed to read an advertisement. I've misplaced that advertisement, but I haven't heard from the guy. So I don't even know whether I'm continuing to read it or not. Is his request. I don't know. Because as you know, it costs money to advertise. And so I don't know. I haven't heard from him. So I'm not going to read it today. That's what I'm not going to do. And so we can get right into our topic. And let me see. So the issue came up regarding this guy named Bishop Barron. Anybody ever heard of Bishop Barron? Well, apparently Bishop Barron has a lot to say about creation. So I was given a video to watch, and this comes from, the email comes from Stefano De Santis. No, I can't figure out whether that's Italian, Spanish, or whatever. Anyway, he says, I have been following your monthly YouTube sessions on Q&A, and he's talking about this program. I'd like to ask a question concerning Bishop Barron's teaching on Genesis. I've been watching one of the bishop's videos on creation and wanted to ask you about the way he interprets Dei Verbum, whereby he comes to an opposite conclusion than yours regarding creation. Oh my God, can you believe it? The video in question is titled Understanding Genesis, Creation. I would appreciate your take on it. Best wishes. So I wrote back to Stefano, and I said, give me the link to the video. I'll be happy to view it and give my 2 cents, which is what I'm going to do now. So maybe the best way to do it is to bring it up on my screen, and then yeah, that might be the best way to do it. So for those of you who want to ask questions, I appreciate your patience. Okay. Looks like we have a few on the board right now. And And then we'll get some more probably. Anyway, so let's get into it. And let me bring up my little note-taking pad here. So if any of you want to see it, it will be on YouTube. And okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through the major points that Bishop Barron made in his video, and then I will comment on them. So he has a host that is hosting him, and the host is asking questions. And Bishop Barron is answering them, which is pretty normal. So Bishop Barron starts out to answering the first question. How would I think the question was something like, how would you interpret Genesis as a whole? And when we say Genesis here, we're really talking about maybe Genesis 1 and 2, not the rest of Genesis. Although Bishop Barron does make exceptions there too. Anyway, Bishop Barron answers this question: how would you approach the interpretation of Genesis? And he says, by looking at the genre. And then he goes into explaining a little bit what genre means. And he says there is, prophetic genre, there is historical genre, there is apocalyptic genre, there is poetic genre, all kinds of, and we're all familiar with that. We know that poetry is not the same as prose. Poetry has a certain rhyme and meter to it and says things in short ways that prose would take, maybe 2 sentences to say the same thing, or maybe 3, who knows. So we definitely know about those genres. Okay, so what he's going to do here is now he's going to pick a genre that he believes Genesis 1 and 2 is, and that will define for him the boundaries of his interpretation, you see. Now, that's a convenient way, basically, of, and I don't want to accuse the bishop of doing this, but, I'm the guy who gets underneath the table, okay? And I see what cards are being exchanged in the poker game that you can't see. And this is one of those times you're going to need me, because although somebody may talk in highfalutin language about the genre of Genesis 1, means that we can only look at it this way. And wow, it sounds so sophisticated, so learned. So, and again, this is not a reflection on Bishop Barron. It's just, where he came from. I mean, because he certainly didn't make all this stuff up. It's from someone else, large groups of people, where this whole idea comes from. That, if you look at genre, and I have nothing against looking at the genre, okay? It's just that when you begin to put too much weight on the genre as the weal or woe of how you're going to interpret this passage, you've gone a little too far, okay? Because a lot of these genres can overlap each other, So they may be part poetry, part historical, part apocalyptic, part prophetic, part this, part that. So to confine it and say, well, here's the specific genre we're going to deal with here, hey, you got to prove that first. You just don't assume it at the beginning and then say everything I'm going to interpret is going to fall in line with this particular genre that I have chosen. No. Okay. Language is a little bit too complicated put strictures around it wherein you're bound to those strictures. As I said, there's a lot of overlap and um, commingling, so to speak, and scripture is that way. Okay. Now, you wouldn't think the poetry, so let's say somebody said, well, the genre is poetic. Okay. So basically what he's telling you from the modern mindset is that we don't have to take much of this as truth, historical truth, you see, because it's poetry. Well, the one book in the Old Testament that has the most poetry, and we would probably say is 100% poetic, is the Psalms. And you know that the Psalms are the one source, the most popular, most used source in the New Testament for New Testament quotes for historical truth. Yep, Isaiah runs a close second, um, and a lot of his language is poetical. Okay, so you would say, okay, you can say it's poetry if you want, but don't give the impression that because it's poetry that somehow that gives you a license to not look at the literal historical message from which it comes. It may be saying it in poetry, but it's still saying something real. Okay, that happened. I mean, if I said Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, and he followed her to school one day, okay, that may be poetic and it may charm your ears when you hear it because it sounds so rhythmic, but it is a fact that there was a girl named Mary and she had a lamb. And it did follow her to school one day, okay? And his fleece was white as snow, okay? These are all historical facts. So it doesn't always make a big difference if I put my language in poetry. I just am saying it a little different than I would in prose, okay? So we all have to be aware of that. And the reason I say that is because of what Father or Bishop Barron goes on to say. He says, Moby Dick is a novel, but when you pick up something about okay, Moby Dick is a novel. It's not a historical event, a real event. Okay, that much we can understand. But he says you might pick up something about how to hunt whales by reading Moby Dick because Melville, the writer, used to work on whaling ships. So he's going to have things in there that are very true about whales. But the book, Moby Dick, is not historical. There wasn't a white big whale that Captain Ahab had to fight. This is all made up by Melville, but he used real things to make up this novel. Okay, we all understand how that works. Okay, no big deal here. But then this begs the question then as to what kind of genre is Genesis? Well, um, that's the question that Bishop Barron asks. And then he says this odd comment. He says, in Genesis, you have shifts in genre. Shifts. It shifts from one genre to the next genre. Well, okay, all right. So that's certainly possible. And then he makes a statement. He says, take, for example, Karl Barth. Karl Barth said Genesis was in the genre of saga. All right. Now, I think that if Bishop Barron, as a Catholic teacher, is going to start dropping names here, we should know who Karl Barth is. Now, if you don't know already, you should go look it up. It's spelled Barth, but the H is usually silent in the way people say it, so it's Karl Barth. Anyway, Karl Barth was a famous Protestant theologian. And a lot of times in current intellectual discussion between Catholics and Protestants, since most of them are liberal, 90% are liberal, and since both parties have basically denuded the Bible of any well, I shouldn't say any, but they have denuded the Bible of its history and have thus filled that vacuum with saying that there's a particular genre that we are reading, you see. And when they usually say that, they're saying, don't worry about the history because this is a particular genre. Underneath of it, they're saying, don't look at this as history. Just look at it as poetry and or some slant on life or wisdom literature or whatever. It may have some truth here or there, but uh, and we will tell you where the truth is. You see, that's the key that they don't tell you is that it does not have all truth, and we're going to be the ones to let you know where it doesn't have the historical truth. You see, not you, we, because we're the smart ones. So that's usually what's going on. But Karl Barth, he wrote an 8-volume set on the Bible, interpretation of the Bible, and the volumes are like 1,000 pages each. This guy could write. I thought I was prolific. He could write, but it's not so much how much he wrote, but the things that he did write. And one of them was that there's no original sin. So you got to remember that about these guys. Now, Bishop Barron, I'm not going to go and accuse him, but I would not be surprised if someday Bishop Barron started watering down original sin. Because if Karl Barth is his mentor, Karl Barth did not believe in original sin. He basically came out and said in the 1950s that men are the way they have always been. Okay. And this was the theological idea that these liberal Catholics and Protestants that, were sharing around this time. The Protestants were way ahead of us. They were 200 years ahead of us in the liberal thought. And the Catholics finally started to catch up around 1940 or so, especially after Pius XII said, okay, you can go in and study, the liberal hermeneutic of the Bible. Now, he didn't say you could endorse it or use it. He just said you can go study it. Boy, was that a mistake. Because when you tell a child, yeah, well, you can go look at it. Here's that nice shiny new bike. You can go look at it, but I don't want you to use it just yet. You know how tempted that child is to just hop on that bike and take a ride on the street and come back and say, what? That's what these guys are like. They're like little kids, looking at the new shiny bike. And the Protestants were saying all kinds of things that to the Catholic ear was blasphemous. And one of them was this thing about original sin. So, good old Karl. I mean, if you don't believe in original sin, then why bother with the Bible, with Christianity? Why bother? Okay, because look, this is giving you the key to what happened back in the Garden of Eden. And everything that happens after that is trying to fix it. And it's not an easy process because there's this devil in the way and he keeps getting in the way. And so it's taken, thousands of years to basically get the devil out of the way. And someday he is going to be out of the way. That's what we call the second coming of Christ. Okay. But if you don't believe in original sin, then why bother being a theologian? Because you're not going to be a Christian theologian. Okay. And yet this was the basis of Karl Barth's teaching. And so I have to wonder, Bishop Barron is no stupid guy. He must know where this guy Karl Barth's coming from. Now, of course, Karl Barth's an intelligent man and he can dress up his writing and make it look really good. Okay. I mean, there are a lot of guys out there like that. They just have a knack, for speaking, writing. Um, but they can write you a lot of horse crap. And unless you're in tune with what's going on and you've studied it, you don't know what's going on. Okay. Um, and I would say the same thing about Bishop Barron's interpretation of Genesis 1. Man, he dresses it up like, Barbie. And you're looking at the store window, and, wow, that sounds good. Wow. But it's all a bunch of hooey. Okay. And that's what I want to be telling you today. But I'm going to tell you how he gets there. Okay. I don't have time to tell you how Karl Barth gets to the position where he doesn't believe in original sin. But this guy was one of the most famous Protestant theologians from Germany, of course, in the 20th century. Okay. And usually, if you are going to be a famous theologian, you're going to have something that distinguishes you. And a lot of these guys know it. So they're looking for something that they can put out there that it's new. And this idea was new. And so Karl Barth became famous. And if you could get rid of original sin, man, how easy Christianity, well, their version of Christianity would be, because now we have the answer why man is evil. Because he always was that way. There was no time where he became sinful and, fell in the Garden of Eden with this devil talking to him, this, cute little snake. And man, they just have a field day with all those images in Genesis. The talking snake, oh my God walking in the cool of the day, and making a light here and then more lights here 3 days later. I mean, they just love that stuff because it ain't true. So, how are we going to defend the Bible? Well, here's one way you do it. You talk about the genre, you see, and guys like Karl Barth, without telling the people where this guy is coming from. Okay, these name droppers out there, and most of the guys that Father or Bishop Barron name drops have a lot of theological baggage that you just don't want to get involved with. Okay, and well, let me move on because this is going to take a while, and it's very important for you. Then Bishop Barron says, or we could call Genesis theologically informed saga, because Karl Barth just called it saga, whatever that means. What does saga mean? I mean, we know the basic meaning, but how does that apply? How is Genesis a saga? Does it mean it just runs on and on with story after story? Is that the kind of thing he's portraying? Well, yeah. I mean, that's the way the Bible's written. So saga is just using another word to just reiterate what we all know about Genesis. So I'm not sure where Karl Barth's going with that, but then Bishop Barron, I keep calling him Father, I'm sorry, says it's theologically informed saga. Let me get a cup of coffee here. And then he says, legend, if you want. Legend, if you want. Or myth, if you want. But that word is so easy to misunderstand, he says. All right, so now we know where he's coming from. Bishop Barron doesn't believe anything in Genesis is historical. It's legend and myth. Okay? And he tries to make that little dent that he just put in your head a lot more less severe by, putting this sophisticated literary word genre on the whole package. But basically, he's saying he doesn't believe a word of Genesis is historically true. Okay. And that falls right in line with all these other Protestants and liberal Catholics, Karl Barth included, Raymond Brown, Father Stanley Yaki, all these guys. They, who's the other guy? Nicanor Austriaco, Father Nicanor Austriaco, another one. You don't probably hear his name too much, but he's in the same um, group as these other guys. They don't believe Genesis at all. Okay. So, but notice Bishop Barron doesn't say, yes, I believe nothing's true in Genesis. But then he'll say it's legend and myth. Okay. Bishop Barron, if you're going to exegete Genesis, just come right out and say it. You don't believe there's any history in Genesis. Okay. You believe this piece of literature was written for an entirely different reason than to give us truth about how God made the world. Okay. Just come right out and say it. And then he says, I'd use the language of quote unquote theological poetry. Theological poetry. Okay. Well, again, just another term that he's throwing out there that sounds sophisticated, but really means, yeah, there may be some theological, teachings in Genesis, but they have nothing to do with creation, so to speak. Okay. They're just poetry, theological teachings put in the poetry of as if I was creating the world kind of thing, whatever that means. But that's what he's trying to sell to us. Okay. He says poems that convey very profound truths. That is the purpose of the world, salvation history, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But as you will see as we go through this, Genesis doesn't tell us about the purpose of the world. All it Genesis 1 I'm talking about. Now maybe Genesis 2 and 3 will get more into that because something tragic happens. But Genesis 1 as a creation story, and that's all they cover in this 30-minute lecture, a 30-minute interview. Genesis 1 doesn't get into the purpose of the world. God says, well, I'm creating the world, and here's the reason why I'm going to do that, blah, 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 blah. It just says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, blah, 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 all the way through to the seventh day. Okay. So there's no profound truths there. There's no salvation history there. So why is Father or Bishop Barron saying this? Because what he's going to do, as you will see, is he's going to avoid the historical context of Genesis 1, and he's going to go to other times in redemptive history and get events from them and then bring them back into Genesis 1 and use them to interpret Genesis 1. Okay. And I call this the anachronistic approach to interpreting Genesis 1, because you don't stay in the time frame of Genesis 1, you go to another time frame and you get some, theological truth from there, and then you ram it back into Genesis 1 and you go, wow, I just interpreted Genesis 1. No, you haven't. Okay. And we'll see that as we go on. He asked the question next, he says, can you find a lot of historical truth in the Bible? And his answer is yes. And I guess it's just like he was saying that, Melville's Moby Dick is a novel, but you can find a lot of truth about whaling in Moby Dick because Melville was a whaler. So I think that's the kind of distinction he's trying to make. But yes, you can find historical truth in the Bible, but we will tell you which one is correct, you see. Do you believe in that silly story about Jonah being swallowed by a big fish? No. That never happens. Do you believe there was a talking snake in the Garden of Eden? No, that doesn't happen. All that kind of stuff. Do you believe Samson was a big, strong man who beat up everybody? No, that's just a myth. It's a legend. You see. So you got to be very careful with these guys, because if they do admit there's historical truth, they're going to tell you what historical truth you can believe. And all the other stuff is just, normal history, you see. All right. So And then he says, the I think it's the interviewer who says, God created the heavens and the earth, means that God created. Oh, okay. So Father Bishop Barron is explaining this because the interviewer says, okay, what does it mean when it says God created the heavens and the earth? Well, Bishop Barron says it means that God created everything except himself, of course. Okay, that much we can trust Bishop Barron with. At least he believes, that God didn't create himself, and he's an eternal being and all that. So we can feel safe there at least. All right. But then he says God created the visible and invisible, like the creed says. Well, the creed, when it says that, is saying something true, but whether Genesis is saying that or not is a debatable question. And at least he should have brought this up for debate, because when it says God created the heavens and the earth, and then the next thing it says is, and the earth was without form and void. Well, you don't get too many spiritual things there in Genesis 1, do you? As a matter of fact, um, I can't name even one spiritual thing that God made in Genesis 1. And that's where the problem comes in. What kind of text is Genesis 1 if it doesn't even specify any of the spiritual things that it supposedly made? The reason is because Genesis isn't talking about that. You see, Genesis 1 is talking about the physical creation and not about angels or about invisible things or anything of that. Okay. And this is where some of our fathers made their mistake by insisting, like Augustine, for example, insisting that the angels had to be in there somewhere. And so the angels became the light that God created. And then once you do that, then you mess up all the other grammatical, historical exegesis you have to put on Genesis, because you just basically threw it out of the ballpark when you said that the angels are light, or the light is angels, by insisting that the angels have to be. No, they don't have to be there. Okay. And a lot of the other fathers told him, you went off the deep end because you insisted upon this. And that's a mistake. One of the clues we know that we're on the right track in saying this is because the firmament is called the heavens in verse 8. Okay. So now that's something physical, not spiritual. So if you're trying to jam in all the spiritual and visible world into the word heavens in verse 1, where it says, and God created the heavens and the earth, you're going to have a problem with the text, because the text won't allow you to do that, because it then defines for you what the heavens are. This thing called the firmament that God called into being on the second day and takes up the whole second day. And at the end of it says, and the firmament is, by the way, the firmament is the heavens. Okay. So now we know that it's something physical, and it's going to have to jibe with what was said in verse 1 about the heavens being created. It's not the spiritual world. Okay. So, as a matter of fact, I make a big point of that in our DVD coming up. Okay. And once you understand that, once you get on the right track of what Genesis 1 is trying to teach, only in the physical realm, the creating realm, then you can understand the rest of Genesis a lot more easily than when you start mixing and matching spiritual with physical and all this stuff. And boy, they've been doing that for years. So now let me move on. The interviewer brings up, the earth was void and darkness was on the face of the deep. And Bishop Barron comes in and says, well, I like how Karl Barth called it the Das uh, Nichtika, if I'm pronouncing that right. That's the German word. I'm not, and which means the nothing or the non-being. So this is how Bishop Barron interprets the phrase, and the earth was void and darkness was upon the face of the deep. not a lick concerning the fact that this is the earth that was created. It's void because there's nothing on it basically except water, and now there's darkness, and we have water because it says the face of the deep. We know that. So the earth and water are the first things that are created. And immediately Bishop Barron goes into the spiritual realm, the philosophical, if you might call that, and calls it the nothing, the non-being. No, because he just said he made the earth, and there was the water, the face of the deep, on the earth. So how could that be nothing? So here's another instance where you're going to get sidetracked if you don't take the text for what it says instead of trying to impose on it some spiritual or philosophical idea, which we don't need to do. There's a lot of spiritual, philosophical ideas elsewhere in Scripture. But when it's dealing with look, this is one of the only places it deals with the physical creation. So pay attention to what it's saying so that you don't dilute it of its actual message. Not a message that you want to put in there, but what the text actually says. And what the text actually says is that there was the earth, it was void, it was dark, and there was water around it. And we're going to need that because we're going to have to go on and explain, well, then why the light was created. Well, because it was dark. Yes, and the earth needs light. And we got to get rid of this water somehow. Okay, and all that. So there's a logical sequence to why Genesis is saying the things in the chronological order that it's saying them, because each day is going to be dependent on the day previous for what's happening on that day. But you're not going to get any of that from Bishop Barron because he calls it a nothing. Well, it's not a nothing. It's a something. And it's something very important. It's the first thing God made, the earth, which does what, by the way? Which discounts Bishop Barron's idea that we came into being by the Big Bang. You see, this is another thing that's not being said in his dealing with Genesis. He believes in the Big Bang theory. He also believes in evolution. And neither of them does Genesis 1 teach. Okay, so, come on, let's be honest with the audience, Bishop Barron. Tell them up front what your motivation is. What is the hermeneutic that you're really using here? Is this just genre, or you have a purpose for telling us it's genre? Because we can all understand genre, but what's the purpose? Tell us. The purpose is you're not gonna believe a word of what Genesis says, and this is why you continually spiritualize it into something other than what the text actually says. And Karl Barth is your mentor, the guy who didn't believe in original sin. All right. Now, he does say something interesting here. He says, don't think of it. That's the earth without form and void and darkness upon the face of the deep. Don't think of it as if it is some primal stuff that God worked with. And I found this quite ironic when he said that, because he knows that there's a lot of, let's say Thomistic philosophers out there who have this penchant to go into Genesis 1 and say, yeah, there's prime matter. You see, God took this prime matter he already made, and then he made the earth with that prime matter, and they think up a sequence that God did here. Now, Genesis doesn't say that, okay, but this is they from their philosophical point of view like to put that in there, the prime matter issue. To me, that's just as bad as the cosmologists is saying there's dark matter out there, because they need the dark matter to basically fill out their whole understanding of the cosmos, and the Thomists need the prime matter to work as Thomas had dictated to them, that has to be the source for all the other matter that came out in Genesis? I'd say no. Okay. Genesis does not get into that kind of stuff. So I think Bishop Barron makes a good point here because he says we are dealing with poetic language, not philosophical language. Okay. But see, it's almost like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing because on the one hand, it'll say, well, we got to use philosophy to interpret this text, but but we'll use poetry to interpret it. And by using the poetry, he doesn't obey what the text is saying. He wants to use poetry to get around what the text is saying. So it's like, isn't that a little contradictory, Bishop Barron? You're accusing the philosophers of putting philosophy into Genesis 1, and then you go put your poetry in there as an excuse so that you don't have to believe the history of Genesis 1. So let's be fair. Let's be honest about what we're doing here. The other thing, too, that I noticed is that although it's correct to say there's no philosophical language in Genesis, and whatever you put in there from your philosophy is brought to the text by you. It doesn't matter whether it's Thomas or any other metaphysical theologian. If you're getting metaphysics out of Genesis 1, it's brought there by you, not by the text. Okay. The text is massaged to the point where someone can think they can put their philosophy in there. Okay. But if you want to go teach about prime matter, you can certainly do that. And good luck proving it. But don't put it into Genesis 1. You can only imply that, well, between God speaking and the thing created, there has to be this prime. You can do that if you want. But that's not what the text is saying. And you have to get that from elsewhere, from some metaphysical shop that you've created, and then you bring that result back into Genesis 1. The other thing is that everywhere else that Genesis 1 is quoted in Scripture, probably a dozen places or more, especially where God says to Israel, when they're in sin, remember, I am the Lord your God who created the heavens and the earth. He does that many, many times to sort of bring them to their senses. Do you remember who I am? I mean, I'm the guy who created everything you see. Okay. So, yeah, when I speak and demand certain things from you, yeah, I think I have some credibility, don't you? So that's basically why that's done. And that's done everywhere. And when they do this, when they quote from Genesis, it's all in the historical framework. It's never in the philosophical or the poetic, like they're quoting as if it may have happened, but it didn't really happen, you know, like when Jesus quotes back in, well, that's probably not a good example. I was going to say when Jesus is quoting, says, they will be one flesh. And that's interesting because today I got a question from somebody, and I won't cover it here, but he says, someone's teaching that Adam and Eve didn't have sex until after the fall. And the fact is that Adam and Eve were married by God in Genesis chapter 2, verses 25 to 28, where Adam says, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. The two shall leave father and mother and cling to one another and become one flesh. That's where they were married. Okay. And what do you do after you're married? You consummate your marriage. Okay. So at any rate, when the rest of the Bible is quoting Genesis 1 or 2 or 3, it never treats it as an unhistorical event, but treats it as a real event. In every instance, when Scripture in the future is quoting from Genesis, every single instance, it's treated as a real historical event that fills out, that abides by all the detail that's put in Genesis 1. Okay, every single time. So that is another thing we need to look at. Okay, so Bishop Barron also says about the earth and the darkness and the void and all that. He says, what is being described is God's power over das Nichtige. That's the way you say it. Das Nichtige. God's power over the nothing. Okay, because he's using das Nichtige from Karl Barth, and das Nichtige means nothing. So, in other words, what this is describing in Genesis 1 is God's power over the nothingness. But here, it seems to be saying a lot, but it's not saying anything. This interpretation. Of course, God's power over the creation. It goes without saying. But what the text is saying is that God made certain things on the first day. He made the earth, the water, and the light. Now, how can anyone miss that? Well, you miss it if you come to the Genesis text and you have made a firm resolve in your mind that Genesis is not teaching history. And so how are you going to explain this earth void and darkness and all that? Well, you talk in a sweet voice to everybody and you say, well, it's just talking about, God's power over these kinds of things. And he demonstrates it by making it look like it was created by him, you see. But the real message, don't worry about the earth and the void and the darkness. The real message is that God has power. Well, we all know that, okay? But what's added to that is the fact that he made these three things: the earth, the darkness, and the light, and the water. So that's what needs to be dealt with, but he doesn't deal with that. He goes off on some spiritual slant because he doesn't believe Genesis is right in saying this, you see, because he believes the Big Bang came first and the earth came 8 billion years later, and so on and so on. Okay, so the next thing he says is in line with the God's power over das Nichtige. He says God's authority over all that would stand to thwart him. So think of the watery chaos as sin and rebellion. All that stands to thwart God's creative purpose. You see how slimy that is? I mean, come on, Bishop. What you have just done is you have imposed a theme on to Genesis 1 without telling the people that you did so, without proving to them that it's correct, and now you're going to use that as the foundation for your exegesis of the text. But the problem is there's nothing in the text that is said to thwart God. Nothing. So even your symbolism is wrong. As a matter of fact, after each day, except the second day, and that's because it does it on the fourth day, it says the creation is good. And God saw that all was good. So there's no evil there thwarting him in the creation story. Okay? What Bishop Barron said, he's getting that from other myths and legends that people had, and he's trying to impose that on Genesis 1. But Genesis 1 will not allow him to do that. Because as I said, it says a refrain. And you see this refrain in Genesis 5 times. And on the last one, it says, and the things were very good. Okay? You see this refrain, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. Why is that saying? Obviously, it's good because God made it. No, God's going to say it's good. It's good because why? Because there is no evil here. What I created is good, true. and there is nothing there thwarting me. Okay? This earth and the void and the light and the well, let's just say earth, void, and darkness are all made that way because there is a purpose to it, because they fit the sequence that God wants to use to produce his final product, which is man, on the sixth day. Okay. But you need every one of these things to fall in order: earth, void, darkness, light, firmament. You keep going. And that's all needed, and it's all good. Okay. Now, the only reason the firmament day, the second day, is not said to be good is because the firmament is again made or used on the fourth day. And after that day, it says, and it was good. Okay. That's the reason. So, this goes totally against Father or Bishop Barron's thesis here that, it's a symbol, a philosophical symbol or whatever of, the thwarting powers that God has power over. No, not in Genesis 1. Okay. Not a word, not one word about anything thwarting him in Genesis 1. Okay. And then he tries to endorse his theory, his interpretation, by saying, well, the water pops up again in the Red Sea, and it pops up again in the water that Jesus calms and walks upon. See, so what he's doing is he's taking, as I said before, future events and how the water is used there, and then superimposing them back onto Genesis 1 as his interpretation of Genesis 1. No. See, a lot of Catholics do this kind of thing because they weren't trained in their seminaries how to interpret Scripture. They come to the text, and because they can't exegete it in the normal grammatical, historical sense, then they start using typology and saying, well, here's the way we interpret the water here, the same way that Jesus used the water over here. No, that's not the way to interpret the biblical text. You take the text for what it says in its own time and for its own reasons, and you interpret the text literally for what it says, and don't go anywhere beyond it unless the text itself is leading you in that direction. Okay. So you get this mixture of allegorical, symbolic, typological, anagogical, mixture coming into Genesis, but Genesis has nothing to do with them at all. Okay. Now, if someone wants to say, well, can't the light represent, can't the light point to Jesus Christ as a light? Well, of course you can do that. Okay. Now, that's good typology. Okay. Because Paul does the same thing in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 when he says, as there was darkness in the time, and then the light came into the world, so the light of Christ comes and dispels the darkness. But you see what Paul's doing? He's not saying that that's the way you interpret Genesis. He's saying that's the way you interpret what Christ did. Because just as the light came and dispelled the darkness in Genesis, well, that's basically what Jesus does, you see? So now you have this typological relationship, but it's a healthy one. It's a healthy one because you're not using it to dilute the historical text of Genesis. If anything, the typological is based on the historical. And it says that historical in a sort of mysterious way, because God's the one author of the Bible, of course, in mysterious ways, saying in a spiritual way what Jesus does against the dark Satan and all that stuff. You see, that's perfectly legitimate. But not when you take the spiritual and then you say, well, that means Genesis has to be spiritual. No. Okay. It means you're trying to avoid the literal historical framework that Genesis gives you that you don't like. Why? Because you believe in the Big Bang Theory. and evolution. So, of course, you're going to have to make these things go away. They can't be historical. All right. Um, that's why I said that much of Bishop Barron's exegesis of Genesis 1 is anachronistic. That is, it's time distorted. You're taking some true event that happened in the future and trying to impose that on Genesis 1, but you can't do that. Okay. All right. So then they go into the spirit or the wind of the Lord that swept over the water. And Father or Bishop Barron says this is the holy breath of God, the creative power and energy of God. The breath of the Lord hovers continually over the world he has made because God is breathing life into the world, sustaining the world, drawing the world to himself. So the author of Genesis is saying that from the beginning, there has been this power brooding over the world. All right. So again, I would say there is this tendency to exegete the text anachronistically from future events that use the Spirit's breath and making them the hermeneutic to interpret Genesis 1. As I said, typology is certainly good to understand how the Bible is connected by the Holy Spirit as its one author, but typology does not exegete the text in its historical situation. Typology takes away from the text, okay? It takes us away from the text. In other words, if someone comes to the Bible and he's going to interpret his major hermeneutical tool is to interpret the Bible by typology. Okay, that's good. Make all these great connections with the New Testament. That's great. Okay. It shows us, yes, there's one author and he ties all these things together. But realize that if you do that, the typology is taking you away from the text, not diving you into the text. Okay, because it's taking you away because you're not going to interpret the text for what the text says. You're going to interpret the text for what something else says that happened in the future and how it may point to it in an allegorical kind of way. All that's good. And believe me, if there's one guy who did that the most, it's me. I did that for many years. I could show you Bibles where, yeah, well, this guy represents this and this event represents that. And man, I had it all. And before I knew it, I was basically superimposing my own ideas on this historical text that had nothing to do with what I was thinking, you see. Or at least, let's put it this way, I couldn't prove that the text was pointing to those things of the future. I can only assume that if the Bible's written this way, then they must be there. They had to be there in every historical event. Okay, you would get a typology out of it, but that's not necessarily true either. All right, so okay, well, I've already been an hour on this. I can't believe I'm taking so long. So I got to move on. Okay, so Bishop Barron goes on to say, God says, let there be light, and there was light. Unlike the ancient myths, God does not create the world out of a violent act or out of an act of violence. It's a sort of a subtle, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. That's the kind of image Bishop Barron is trying to create here. We all understand that, but wasn't it Bishop Barron just a few moments ago who said that the darkness and the water that came before the light were symbols of a thwarting of God's plan, that God was going to show that he had control over them? That this darkness and the water and the void represented sin and rebellion. Well, aren't they violent acts? So I just could not follow. It just seemed like his interpretation was contradicting itself. Because if Genesis is trying to distance itself from the other cultures who always had violent acts, and then brought in the calmness created by the God, whoever it was, well, that means that Bishop Barron's interpretation of Genesis is just like theirs. because he just said that the water and the void and the darkness was sin and rebellion. That what else would thwart God's plan besides sin and rebellion? Okay. So I don't see any difference between his interpretation and their interpretation. Okay. And this is what happens when one does not read the text in its historical framework. The symbols one applies to the text often begin to contradict one another. And that is because they are man made symbols, often made by those who refuse to read the text historically because they believe in another way the world was created, such as Bishop Barron, who believes in the Big Bang Theory and evolution. Okay. Um, and then he says, if the breath of Yahweh is a consistent symbol, look at light. What does Jesus say? I am the light of the world. In God's opening move of let there be light is implied that from him comes the light of the spiritual life, of the moral order. Let there be light means let there be luminosity insofar as knowing things and intelligibility. All right. So we see the same thing. He's not looking at the text for what the text says. He's looking at something that Jesus said and imposing that on Genesis 1. So again, we see the anachronisms in his analysis. And here it is more deliberate. Instead of interpreting the text for what it actually says, that is, that God created a great light to dispel the darkness and give the world a day and night rhythm so that when one day ends, the next day begins, Bishop Barron avoids the historical text and rushes to spiritualize it by using images of spiritual light that are interspersed in the Bible. Again, the underlying motive that is not stated but is plain to those who know better is that Bishop Barron is devaluing Genesis 1 of any literal or historical reality and instead turns the text into a theological poetry, implying that there is only a theological meaning to the text, not a literal meaning. Okay? This is what's going on behind the scenes that you need to know. And then they start talking about God made creeping things, the animals, and everything else in nature. And in one sense, Bishop Barron says it means God is dethroning these things. He is saying, no, not God, not God, not God, pointing to the creeping things, not God, pointing to the animals, not God. Okay? That's how he interprets this whole thing. But what we have to say, and I'm trying to rush through this now to get this done, but this is not what the text says. Again, we have more anachronism from Bishop Barron. He seeks to interpret the text by looking forward to the time in which pagans will worship animals and creeping things, and uses that as the basis for why the Genesis writer gave us such detail about God creating the animal world. Again, the text says that all that God created was good, and thus the reason he provides such detail about the creation is to show how each part of creation was made on a particular day, and how, from this divine organization, it all fits together perfectly, so that in the end, God can crown his creation with man, who he makes in his own image. Okay? But somehow, you know, Bishop Barron is imposing what he knows from other cultures onto Genesis 1. And that's because they believe Genesis 1 was written by some Jew in about, 500 BC or so, who came back from Babylonian captivity and wanted to reinvigorate his Jewish brethren on coming back from a captivity and starting to build the wall in Jerusalem again. Okay. So, in other words, it's a made up story that a Jewish priest wrote to get his people excited about going back to Jerusalem, but it has no history value in itself. It's just a treatise to make the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, look better and bigger than Marduk, the god of the Babylonians. That's the only reason that the guy decided to write it. You see, I mean, after all, they've been under captivity for 70 years under the god Marduk, and now they're finally being released. Well, what better way to show that your God is better than Marduk by writing this creation story? Because when Marduk was a god, he had to depend on other gods for his own godness and his origin, but not the God of Yahweh. See, he called things out of nothing, and he made them all. By that made him greater than Marduk. You see, so it's a competition between gods, and that's where Bishop Barron's getting all this stuff. Why is he talking about, you know, the animals not being God? Well, because the Babylonians used to do that. They used to think of their animals as gods, and the Greeks did, and everybody did it. So Bishop Barron is saying, well, the Genesis writer wants to get away from that. Well, why would he? If he's just talking about a creation story, why would he even mention that stuff? Well, because Bishop Barron is taking from the future. The whole reason is from the future of why Genesis 1 was written. You see, it was written as a sort of competitive piece against Marduk, not to give us factual information about the creation story. He's already decided that. And all of liberal Catholic and Protestant theology has already decided that. Why? Well, because we believe in Einstein and the Big Bang Theory, you see. And if that's true, then none of this stuff in Genesis can be true. It's just poetry. Come on. You see, that's what's happening. And you'll get some guys, like Father Yaki, he used to teach at Seton Hall University, saying he was Hungarian. Let's see if I can do a Hungarian accent. These two lights in Genesis 1. The first light comes, and then 3 days later, there's 3 more lights. The sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay, well, how can that be? Because, we see the sun coming up every day, and we see the stars going around every day. There's no big light anywhere. Okay, so he would say, the Genesis story is not history, because if it was, then the Genesis writer would have made an error, saying that there was this big light in the beginning on the first day, and then we have the lights coming again. And we all know that means that the sun is basically the only light. And maybe the stars out there, but they don't give much light. Okay? So he's saying the Genesis writer's confused, or he's lying to us. He doesn't know what he's doing. Okay? And therefore, it can't be inspired by God, because God sure knows what he's doing. And that's why most of these Catholic liberals will say that the so-called historical portions of Scripture were not inspired by God. The only thing that was inspired are perhaps Genesis 3:15, prophesying the coming of Christ, and all the rest of that stuff. At least the liberal theologians, it just didn't happen. Okay, so they have a very hard time trying to pick out what's real and what's not real in Genesis, because the whole thing is written where one thing depends on the next thing, and so on and so on, in strict chronological order, that if you take out one thing and say, well, that's not true, then you mess up everything else, because now you've taken out the connecting piece between one historical event and the other. And they've had the hardest time trying to piece Genesis back together once they start saying, well, these part about the talking serpent, that never happened, you see, because there are no talking serpents. Yeah, good luck trying to tie the rest of Genesis together. Okay, and they've never succeeded yet. They did the same thing with the life of Jesus. We had two in the past, 300 years, we've had 2 historical quests for the true Jesus of history, wherein they tried to separate his miracles and prophecies from his actual life as a man, and they just were never able to do it, because the miracles and the prophecy and the divine part is so intertwined with the historical man part that there's no way you can separate them and give a cogent story. Okay, everything is dependent on everything else. And they've had 2 times a major world events where they tried, all these theologians got together and they tried to figure, and they couldn't figure it out. And what they were trying to do was trying to debunk the Gospels, that Jesus, and to come to the conclusion that Jesus was just a man, that people glorified into becoming God. Okay, that's what they were trying to do, and they utterly failed. Okay, just look that up on the internet, the historical quest for Jesus, and you'll see all these movements. All right, I'm almost done, people, so bear with me here. All right, so he makes this, he says, what is it like when God creates this first, that first, then the animals, and then man. What is that like? Well, he says they come forth in order. And Catholics recognize this as the way the liturgy begins. What we are seeing is a kind of liturgical procession, which tells us the purpose of creation to enter into a great chorus of praise to the one who created them. Who comes last in the liturgical procession? The one who leads the praise, the priest or the bishop. Who comes last in the great procession of the book of Genesis? Human beings. There's the whole story. And I'd argue, Brandon, that is the hermeneutical key to much of the Bible. Well, what we should say here is although there are certainly symbolic or allegorical parallels between the procession of the Catholic liturgy having the priest as the last person in line, with man being made on the last day of creation, but this is not what the historical text of Genesis says. One has to read into the text such an allegorical meaning, and that's what Bishop Barron constantly does. Again, why does Bishop Barron do this? Because he believes man came from apes and that the creation was actually the Big Bang. So the only way he can salvage the text as having some higher meaning is to constantly apply spiritual meanings from other events and personages of the future. You see, again, that's what's going on. He hasn't really exegeted the text of Genesis at all, not once in this whole half-hour interview. And he says, and whenever something goes wrong, it's because of bad praise. As Augustine put it, they mistook the creature for the creator. Yes, worshiping the creation rather than the creator is a perennial problem of mankind. Everyone knows that. But that didn't come until Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve worshiped the serpent rather than God. Okay? Genesis 1 and 2 has no problem. And yet, Bishop Barron wanted to impose all kinds of thwarting God's plan over here and all that stuff. No, it was all good. What made it evil was Adam and Eve's decision at that time to thwart God's plan. But that didn't come until Genesis 3. And we interpret the text for that. But, and here's a big but, the mentor of Bishop Barron, Karl Barth, didn't believe in Genesis 3 and the fall of Adam and Eve. So all that to Karl Barth was just theological poetry, okay? Not an historical event. So somebody go ask Bishop Barron, hey, Bishop Barron, what do you do with the idea that Karl Barth didn't believe in original sin? What do you do with that? In other words, he was a heretic in heresy. And yet you use him as the, Dashanistika was the interpretation Karl Barth put on Genesis. So what? This guy didn't get his theology right first before he started interpreting Genesis. So that means everything he says is tainted by this blackness of throwing original sin out the door. Okay? That should have been the first thing that Bishop Barron said. All right. He says, after all this, it says God rested on the seventh day. The unchanging, omnipotent God doesn't get tired, though. So it's a symbol here. Well, you got to be careful here. It's not a symbol. It just has a different meaning. Then rest can mean different things. It can mean you were exerting yourself and now you need to rest because you're tired. Or it could mean that you just stopped your working. It doesn't mean you're tired. It just means you stopped working and now you're at rest. At rest means you're not moving. You're at a rest state. Okay, there's two different ways to look at the word rest. And the second way is the way that we look at it with God. He doesn't get tired, of course. Okay. Now, Father Barron does make a good point here. He says that the way that we understand God resting is that God is savoring his creation. Okay. Well, that's good, Bishop Barron. I really appreciate that. So you got to be careful then, though. It's not symbolic. It's a real rest, but it's a rest that doesn't mean God is tired. It means he's savoring his creation. That would be the better way to say it. That way you don't denude the word rest from its a literal meaning that it has. It does literally mean to stop from what you were doing, and you can imply from that that you're savoring what you have just done. Okay, that's a real meaning, real literal meaning. So that's the only thing I would caution here. And there's one other thing I wanted to say, and that is, oh, okay. So he says, you know, God is savoring his creation, but, he didn't tell us anything that God created in the chapter. It was all some symbolic spiritual application of what was said to be created, is what Bishop Barron did. Okay? So, like, when the guy created the light, he just says, well, that's like the light of Christ and all this. But he didn't tell us that God created the light on the first day. And then after that came the firmament. You see? So, how is it exactly that God is savoring his creation when Bishop Barron really didn't give us any detail of what God created, literally and historically? So, how can he be savoring over it? Now, he will come back and say, well, God is a creator and he's savoring over his creation. Yeah, well, see, then they want to put a period after that and not allow us to give any detail about what it means that God created. Of course, God can sit back and savor his creation in general. That would make sense. But when we start putting details, say, well, he did this on day one, he did this on day two, this on day three. Oh, no, you can't do that. See, because it's not an historical text, it's just poetry. But yet that same poetry says that God created the heavens and the earth. Well, isn't that poetry also? And if it's poetry and just a genre, and it doesn't really have a historical meaning because the rest of Genesis isn't historical according to you, then how can you even say that God created the heavens and the earth is historical? Okay? That's a very logical question. You see, and that's what Father Raymond Brown used to do. He says when you teach a child Genesis 1, you just read the first sentence, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then you close the book because we don't want to give them any detail. And if they happen to read the detail, you just says, well, that's just the story. The only thing we have to believe here is that God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? So you form the dichotomy in the child's mind that now he has to split scripture from what you tell him is historical and what isn't historical. And that's basically the whole rest of Genesis 1 that isn't historical, you see. So no wonder our Catholic kids grow up in Catholicism not knowing their faith, not putting trust in scripture, not believing what the traditional magisterium says about this stuff. No wonder, because we got people like Bishop Barron telling us that none of it's true. But the Big Bang is true and evolution is true. Two of the very things that are having the most trouble in science, even giving any credibility to what they teach, which will take me another hour to explain, but I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to end that little discussion here about Bishop Barron and go on to our questions. All right. So sorry it took so long. All right. Okay. So Alex Malone says, question, do you think David and Solomon were saved even though they had so many wives and concubines? Why did God only punish David for his Bathsheba and census incidents, but not his many concubines? Well, I think we went through this last time, didn't we? So I don't want to repeat a lot. If you want to go, because I treated this wife and concubine issue in depth, I think, was when I covered it last. So let me move this camera over here. But let me address the other issue. David, all indications show us that David was a saved man. Paul uses him as an example of a justified man in Romans chapter 4, right alongside with Abraham. So he's in good company there. And that was the incident that he had with Bathsheba, and he repented of his sin. And St. Paul says that that is an example of someone who was justified. Okay, so now that's interesting because the question that would come up would be, was David justified before that? And the answer would be yes. Okay, but he lost his justification when he committed mortal sin with Bathsheba. So if Paul is using him as an example of someone who is justified, well, that means that David was rejustified. And this is exactly what the Catholic theology teaches, that you can, be zipping along in your life and fall into mortal sin. And if you do, then you just lost your justification. You're on your way to hell. Okay. Until you, go into the confessional box and you repent of your sin and it's absolved by the priest, then you are justified again. And you're restored back into the faith. Okay. So David is an excellent example of the Catholic theology of justification, if there is any. And he's the supreme example. So now Solomon, we do have a question about Solomon, because 1 Kings chapter 11 gives one of the worst, what do you call those things? Epitaphs of a king in Israel that's ever been written. Okay. So here is a man who suffered by falling into sin with all the concubines and wives that he had, so much so that God inspired the writer to write this terrible, terrible end to Solomon's life, that he went into apostasy because of these wives. So we don't know. We don't have a good idea where Solomon is. David is a lot more secure. But Solomon, yeah, we have a problem. So I'm going to go on to the next question because I already covered the other part last week. Question from Con Lives. Somebody left their phone down here. All right. Who committed the greater sin? Eve by listening to the devil, or Adam by listening to his wife? Well, Paul makes that answer for us in 1 Timothy chapter 2, when he is speaking of Adam and Eve, and he says that Eve is under the authority of Adam. One, because Adam was created before her, okay, which a lot of people sort of miss when they read that chapter. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. Okay, she's under the authority of man because Adam was created first. So that has nothing to do with the fall. Second, and the woman was deceived. Okay, so what's happening there is that Paul is putting the brunt of the fall on Eve, who became deceived by the devil. And then there are certain consequences for that. And then, of course, he says in verse 15, and she will be saved by childbearing. And he's talking about literal childbearing there. Why? Well, because the first sin of Eve in wanting to become a god was that she didn't have to bear children, because gods don't bear children. And so that would be a way out of getting out from under the command to be fruitful and multiply. Okay. Because, it's painful, it's drudgery, it's this, it's that, to raise children, and it ties you down to the children. It does not allow you to assume the heights of heaven, so to speak. And so she would much rather be a god than have to bear children and be a mother. So that's the basic motivation for the sin, and we can imagine her and the devil discussing this. And, the devil pointing this out, hey, Eve, it can be a lot easier on you. Believe me. This God, he's burdened you with all this childbearing stuff. Um, he's just doing this because he doesn't want you to become a God like him. Okay. So let me make it easy for you. Just eat this apple. Presto, things will change. I mean, how inviting could that be to become a God? You know? Um, um, so Paul puts the brunt on Eve in that sense, but he doesn't stop there, of course. There are other places where he talks about Adam, and Romans 5, verse 12 is the first place where he does, and that is talking about Adam in the sense that he led the whole world into sin and death. Adam. So, in other words, um, Eve may have been deceived and caused Adam to fall. And because of Adam's fall, it's the whole world that's now plunged into sin and death, not Eve. So, in other words, if Eve, well, let's say Eve sinned, and then she said to her husband, "Here, take and eat." And instead of being a dumb ox and sitting there and taking a bite, he said, "You speak as one of the foolish women speak." Of course, there were no other women at that time, so I'm just using Job. Say the same thing Job said to his wife when she said, "Just curse God and die." And Job says in Job 2:10, "You speak as one of the foolish women speak." If Adam had said that to Eve, we wouldn't be in this mess. And then, he could have brought her to God, and, two things could have happened. She could have been executed, and God would have created another Eve, or she would have been punished, and but there would be no sin and death, you see, because Adam hadn't sinned. He was the head, and that makes all the difference if you're the head, because that means you're the one who's responsible for what happens to everybody else. Okay. So in that sense, um, Adam created the greater sin. Okay. Not that there's any discussion in the Bible about this. There's no competition between Adam and Eve. Well, who sinned greater? It just doesn't get into that. It just tells you the consequences of each person's sin. And you can see from the fact that with Adam, everyone's plunged to sin and death. Now, think about this too. Um, most of the world's not going to be saved. That's pretty clear in Scripture. Now, I could be wrong, but it seems to imply in many, many different places that even though we have salvation, most of the world is not going to accept it, and they're going to go into damnation. So how would you like to have that on your conscience if you were Adam? Yes, one thing for the Jesus Christ to come and offer salvation to the world, to fix what you broke, Adam. But think about it this in its totality. Think about it where these very people that you plunged into sin and death, they're all going to refuse to accept the salvation. And that's because of you. So there's another way to think about it. Okay. Now, granted, he wasn't directly involved, but he's indirectly involved. So, all right. Let's go on to the next question. In Genesis 15:8, Abraham called God Yahweh, but in Exodus 6:3, Yahweh himself said that he didn't reveal himself with his name to Abraham. Is there a contradiction? Well, let me see. Genesis 15:8. Put the old glasses on and go to work. Genesis 15:8, I think you said, yes. 15:8. He said, you are correct. It says, Vaya emer Adonai Yahovah. And that's the tetragrammaton. So you have a good question there. And now, so let me just look up Exodus 6:3 just for comparison. Okay, so 6:3. Okay, so it says, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, and my name Yahovah, not, that's lo, no, da, t. I did not reveal myself. Lahem, to them. So yeah, I never saw that before. So I'm going to have to do some work on that one. I'll see what the story is for you. Okay, well, thank you for that question, Peter. Genesis 15:8 and Exodus 6:3. All right, so I don't have an answer for you now, but next week, come back and I will have an answer for you. And it may be, I don't know, or it may be something more intelligent. All right. Next question. Is the author of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah? Only somebody who comes from Bishop Barron's camp would ask that question. Is there a second or third Isaiah? I've heard that to sustain this hypothesis, they cite the use of the proper name of Cyrus. Yeah, see, that's part of the liberal hermeneutic, is they want to make each book a redaction of the original author. So they'll allow the original author at least some, place in the book that's named after him. But then they want redactors to come along. And that's why you have second or third Isaiah. Okay. There is absolutely no proof of that. What they do is they go into the text and they'll say, well, Isaiah 40, and onward is so different from Isaiah 38 and 39. It seems like a new topic. And so they'll say second Isaiah started at Isaiah 40. Okay. And that will go to what? I don't know, Isaiah 50, 51 or something. And they'll say, well, and then, the genre changes and all this stuff. And so it's not like the second author. And so it has to be third Isaiah, and that'll take them up to book 66, chapter 66. That's the way they come to the Bible. So you got to understand, when the Bible got into the universities, and this is during, the late Renaissance, the early Enlightenment, when science became the king. Okay, think of Isaac Newton, 1687, Principia Mathematica, conquered the world. Okay, we had a formula for how the earth goes around the sun. I mean, how much more sophisticated can you be? We have the power. Okay, so if we can do that with the cosmos, just think what we could do with the Bible. Okay, so the Bible gets into the universities and they treat the Bible just as if they would treat, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey or Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice or whatever, and take it apart, put it back together, and then they'll tell you, well, here we think there was redaction. Here we think there's textual problems. Here we think that the context doesn't match what the previous chapter said, and blah, blah, blah. And they, get all these things again. And they make their conclusions, you see. So that's where you get this, 1, 2, 3 Isaiah garbage from the liberal camp because they think they're so sophisticated. You can't read the Bible for what the Bible says. Actually, you just can't do that. So you have to put your literary skills to the Bible, and then you really understand how it's put together. But it's not inspired. They don't believe it's inspired by the Holy Spirit. You see, and so if you believe it's put together by men, well, of course you're going to come up with theories like this. Okay, that's where it all comes from. All right. Question. I once heard you explaining why Lucifer disobeyed God. He put God in a bind, but then God outsmarted him through the incarnation. Can you explain it again? Any church father support? Good question on that one. I haven't looked at that yet, but I'm sure there's, because I've come across similar things. But what my analysis, was. Let me drink the rest of this. Was Satan put God in a bind because Satan knew that if he could get Adam and Eve to dissolve their allegiance with God and come with the devil, that God would have basically failed. Okay. Because now he had two choices. He could destroy the whole thing and, possibly start over. But, like, what's the sense in starting over? You've already shown that the two creatures you made in your own image, who were going to be exemplars of you, have fallen, and were deceived, as intelligent as they were, as great as the creation that they were deceived by their own free will. So why bother starting over again? I mean, it's already been shown that it doesn't work. Okay. So that's one thing God had to face. And the devil knows this, okay? Adam and Eve may not know all the intricacies. They're being taught, of course, by the devil, but they don't. The devil's thought this all out. So he thought it all out. So, and if you're going to allow Adam and Eve to live, even after they've rejected you, well, then the rules are that I'm the one who deceived them. And so the devil says, and I'm going to be their master, basically. And that would be true. And it's true today, isn't it? Yeah. That's why St. Paul says that the devil is the god of this world in 2 Corinthians 4:4. So what do you do? How do you get out of this mess? If you destroy them, you're basically admitting that it was a mistake. I should have seen it coming. Why create them in the first place? and that would give you justification to just destroy the whole thing. But then, is that what a God does? I mean, is that the extent of your plan? That somebody failed and now we just have to destroy it all? Is that how far you thought it out? So that's a bind, okay? Because if you don't have an ulterior plan, plan B, let's say, doesn't look good. Doesn't look good at all. Um, and then what are you going to do with this devil? He's taken over. How long is he going to be around? Well, there's really no time limit. I mean, he won. He won the battle. This is not going to be a best out of 7. Okay. This is one time only. Who's got the better stuff? God or the devil? And God lost. Okay. In that temporal time. You compare it to like when the devil goes up to heaven in Job chapter 1. And God's provoking the whole incident and says to the devil, where you been? What have you been doing? Now, notice he has access to heaven. That's one of the things he won in the Garden of Eden. And the devil says, I've been walking to and fro in the earth and checking out man and seeing if there's anything there worth pursuing. And God says, have you seen my servant Job? This wise man Job, who greater than all the men of the East and never sins. And now this is God provoking the incident. This isn't the devil saying, hey, I see this guy Job down there. Let me go down there and mess him up. See what he's really made of. This is God provoking the incident. So, what does that tell you about our God? What does it take to go and provoke the devil, who already won in the Garden of Eden? Okay. Well, and let's put it this way. You can't say that, well, God already knows Job's going to win. No, it's not the way the text approaches this issue. This is a bet. This is a do or die. And again, it's not the best out of 7, like the NFL football. This is whoever wins, wins. And he hands over all his chips. Okay. So, and God would not be honest in the bet if he based it on what he knew Job was going to do. Okay. It's not a fair bet. So somehow, some way, this thing has to be fair, and then the devil accepts. And the devil's not saying to God, oh, by the way, can't you, know the future and predict what or prophesy what Job's going to do? And if God said, yeah, well, then devil, smart enough not to take the bet, right? So again, that's logic tells us that can't be involved. So you see, there's much more to this whole thing when you read between the lines and you figure out what's going on with these two spiritual beings. Okay. So the question would come back to God. Is that all there is? Is that all there is? Man falls, and you hadn't thought about that possibility before, and now he falls, and the whole thing's kerplunk, and we either get destroyed or we have the devil as our master for eternity. Okay. So here the the parameters of the situation. So God, being, infinitely intelligent, of course has thought this all out. Okay. And made a plan that we could probably call Plan A, if we want, well, maybe not, because that'll be confusing. Um, wherein he took this all into account and knew that the devil would think he could trap God into having the worst of two possibilities as his choices. Okay. Because the devil never thought about what the third choice would be. And that would be that God, in order to save man from his debacle, would become a man, suffer and die on the cross to appease the Father's wrath, and everything then would be just. So there's no cheating here, because the devil knows that God has honor, and there has to be an appeasement, and it's going to have to be won by well, at least he eventually knew this. It's going to have to be done by someone who's worthy, because that's just not going to take anybody. And this is what God had thought of before Adam and Eve sinned. Okay, so that if he falls into sin, here's the plan. And the devil had not a clue that God would even think about this, let alone do it. I mean, think about it. God becomes a man. God becomes a man. I mean, if you really know who God is, the more you contemplate that issue, God becomes a man, lowers himself to that extent to salvage what is salvageable in this debacle. Wow. Okay. So that's what it says in 1 Corinthians 2:8. If the devil had known what God had planned, he never would have entered into this arena. But he had no idea. Of course, God's not going to tell him. Okay. And everything's fair and everything's just. Everything was settled. Because, see, God can't lie. If there's one thing the Bible is clear about, God cannot lie. Titus chapter 1, verse 2, Hebrews 6:13. It just comes right out and says it. God cannot lie. So when God sets something up, he can't give a pretense that it's fair, because that would be a lie. It has to be absolutely just. Okay. Because of who God is. Okay. So this is why I said what I said about Job. God sets the test up for Job, and he has to be absolutely fair. That all is dependent not on God's foreknowledge, but on Job's free will. And Satan gave it its best shot. And of course, our liberal friends are going to say, oh, this never happened. This is just a theological poetry, you see. Never happened in history. It's just the way the Jews wrote about their experiences. It made it look like, Job was tortured and God was testing him and all that. Yeah, that's what they'll tell us. The same guys who say there's first Isaiah, second Isaiah, and third Isaiah. Okay. So beware of that as well. So yeah, that's why I say the devil thought he had God trapped, because he thought God only had two choices. The third choice was God becoming a man, suffering on a cross for our sin, and giving us justification justly, because he did exactly what it requires to appease God's wrath. And only he could do it. Okay. So, wow. Yeah. So God pulled a fast one on the devil, huh? Well, we shouldn't say that, because that gives sort of a derogatory image. God just the devil just didn't know what God was capable of doing. I mean, if you're the devil, would you ever think that God would become a man to take care of this stupid little man that he created who didn't have enough sense to throw the apple on the ground and say no? I mean, he looks at the universe just like you and I do. He knows that nobody else could have created it and how intelligent and wise God must be to make something like this. Okay. So what makes him throw it on the ground instead? I mean, eat the apple instead of throwing it on the ground. No, because Eve says, you could be a God just like God. Pretty tempting, I guess, at that point in time. Pretty tempting. Okay. So, yeah, and then to save this little runt, God, have to become a man because that's the only way that you will be propitiated, that you will be satisfied that a proper sacrifice has been made to appease your wrath and to restore your honor. You know that, and you cannot accept anything less because then you would be less than God. Okay. So it's not only that God can think of this plan, but this plan has to be perfectly just. Otherwise, God would have to live with the fact that he scrimped here and he scrimped there and didn't put all the pieces properly together and just sort of, hope for the best. And it turned out okay. No, God can't live with himself for eternity with that in mind. It's got to be perfect, perfectly just, that God is completely satisfied, you see. So it has to mean not just quantity, but quality also has to be in the redemptive plan. Okay. So, yeah. So that's why I use that analogy. Okay. The devil, because you have to ask yourself, why would the devil take the risk? Think about that. Why would he take the risk to put it all on the line unless he was certain that God couldn't get out of it? Because he only had two choices: either destroy the whole thing or you let us live for eternity in the state we're in without any redemption. I mean, think about that. If you were the devil and you thought, God, I've been over this and over this and over this and over this, and God only has two choices, and both of them are going to destroy what he just created. Okay. Um, and that's because he has no idea, no image, no nothing that God could become a man. That was the last thought that the devil had. And it would have been the last thought you and I had, if ever was a thought. Okay. So that's why he took the chance, because he thought he could win. Because an intelligent being like that's not going to take the chance unless he thinks he can win. Why do that? Okay. You would never do that. Some dumb animal might do that. Let's take this piece of meat and on the hope that nobody catches me, you know, uh, but not somebody like that. Okay. With full intelligence. Just doesn't happen. All right. So that's why I say that. I hope that was good for you, Alex. All right. We got 5 minutes left. Question: the creation of the universe within 6 years doesn't seem plausible. I think you mean 6,000 years, right? Not 6 years. Modern science doesn't support this view. Others, for example, the Indian Hindu tradition, have creation that's millions of years old. So where's the question there, Raghavar? Raghavar, let me just say this. I've been studying evolution and creation for 25, 35, 45 years. Okay. I can honestly sit here and tell you that um, the whole evolutionary hypothesis is just total, absolute bunk. And the only way, as a matter of fact, when we did our creation thing, this, you know, how the world was made in 6 days, I was even more thoroughly convinced that yes, it has to work this way. You cannot spread this out over time and sort of hope for the best. It has to be truncated into these 6,000 years or 6 days or whatever, because that's the only way it's going to work, scientifically speaking. Okay. It's the only way it's going to work. So I don't have time to get anything more than that for you, but you're going to need to do a lot more study. Don't base it on what you hear someone say. Okay. If you want to know about this topic, go in and study it. And it's going to take years for you to study it. Okay. Until then, don't make any comments like, I just can't believe in the creation. I have to believe in evolution. Um, and especially, Indian tradition. Come on. I studied Indian tradition as my major in college. Okay. I know all about it. The Bhagavad Gita and all that stuff. Okay. It's all made up. Okay. It's all made up. There's nothing real to it. And I'm sorry if I have to step on your toes and tell you that. Okay. It's all bunk. All right. All right. Question. In the Ark of Noah, are there 2 or 7 of every kind? How is this to be interpreted, the word kind in that narrative? Okay. So the basic way is you're going to get 2 of every kind. Okay. That's your foundation. And then you're going to have 7 of the clean animals only. So you have 2 of clean and unclean, and then you have 7 of the clean. Why would that be the case? Because they're going to eat the clean. That's why. The 2 clean and unclean are going to eat the 7 clean animals. Okay, that's the reason you would have them in the ark for it's going to be about a year. Okay, and these guys eat. So if they're carnivorous, which many of them are, and plus the humans have to eat as well. So what are they going to eat? They're going to eat meat just like they did before, because there's not going to be many vegetables there. They're not going to last long. But the animals, they will last a long time because they're going to be alive until you butcher them. Okay, so that's the reason you have 7. And it's only of the clean animals. Okay. And that would be as much as, Noah could put in the ark. Okay. All right. So it is 5 o'clock and I've got to go. Time is up. And before I go, thank you for being here and thank you for putting up with me and all my little, accents and stuff, and especially going overboard with Bishop Barron and his creation story. But I think that will be beneficial for a lot of people. And on the Yahweh thing, I'm going to check that out after I'm done here and see what the story is, and I'll have an answer for you next week. In the meantime, please go visit robertsongenis.org and see the nice collection of books and lectures and debates and all kinds of good things that you would want for your Catholic faith. Many of the discussions we've had here today are in the books and the lectures that I've given that you can purchase at robertsongenis.org. And if you would be so kind, please give us a little donation to help us continue the work here. And you can also become a monthly donor if you would like, but please consider that. All right. Thank you so much for being here. God bless you all. Stay healthy, keep the faith, and don't fall into sin.